Good evening, everyone. I extend a very warm welcome to all the participants in this webinar. Thank you for being there this evening. I, Architect Mildred Jose, your moderator for today, extend a very warm welcome to the first day of the webinar lecture series titled Deducing India's Northeast Trends, Problems and Prospects, organized by the Center for History and Archaeology. Before I proceed with the first speaker for today, we have with us Ms. Surabhi Ghosh Maulik, the Chief Executive of the Center for History and Archaeology, who would be enlightening us and giving us a brief of ASSR. Over to you, Surabhi ma'am. Ma'am, please come on board.
Yes, thank you, Mildred. Here we are to celebrate our, I think it is 7th webinar of ASSR. Before that, we already in COVID period, we started the webinar and 6 already has been done. So today's webinar, as subject said by Mildred, and that our speaker is Dr. Santosh Hasnu, am I right? I think is the name. And today, as the very first, I will say to everyone, Kumno. Vishnu, I think I'm right. It is hello.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. Very, very true.
Kumno to all of you, all my Northeast people. And Khulbei, thanks to select me as a part of this chapter. From SSR and CHA, I am here just to say that to do something substantial, we are celebrating this webinar and we are here presenting ourselves with the part of SSR and CHA that many things unspoken and many things unknown to our generation to be opened through some scholars. As we know, Northeast was not actually known very much. I think I think after independence, they are not getting much chance to come in forward and make a link with Delhi people or someone. And the Northeast was neglected a lot, as I must say. It is a big thing, a big Seven Sisters place that was often I read in language. It is in Mahabharata. It is in Kalika Puran. Even in Tagore. Tagore took the character of Chitrangada from Manipur in his famous dance drama, Chitrangada. So we know the beauty of Sikkim, the innocence of Garo Hills and the Khasi in Shillong, the beauty of nature and the language and the food and many ways. But it was not too much elaborated politically or dominant literature. Today here with the through the ASA CHA, we will try our best to open up all blocks. We will try our humble, true, honest, honest presentation to know more about the Seven Sister Lands. I went to Sikkim. I never forget the beauty. I went to Shillong and I had been 3 years in Bhutan. Till I celebrate those days in my memory, the beauty, unparalleled heaven, I never found in anywhere. The Meghalaya, the Garo, the Assam, the everyone is the people I saw very soft, very nice. I love them. I had some friends there. And today in this seminar, I welcome, I will say in Assam, Adavani, to Mr. Santosh to tell us something new, something different, and hope everybody will join a lot. And I must thank before starting, to Kaushik Bhua, who are taking a lot of pain to prepare this project. With love, now over to Mr. Santosh.
Thank you so much. So I can begin. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. So my work basically looks at the transport history in the colonial Northeast, and my PhD was basically looking at different forms of transport systems, and aviation or air transport is one of the subject of my research interests. And today I wanted to share a part of my research, which is also a small piece has already been published in EBW article 2 years back, and before the pandemic lockdown, I wanted to go into depth into this and explore and revise my work on aviation history or air transport. So, and my current research is an attempt to explore aviation history, not only in Northeast, but South Asia as a whole, looking at it and how the history, looking at the history of the coming of this transnational air transport between India, China, and Burma. When we look at the history of aviation, if we study it as an in isolation and studied it only in the perspective of technological history, aviation or air transport history per se may look very boring and trite. But the subject of aviation history appears in the most interesting light if aviation or air transport is seen from the perspective of interdisciplinary or different themes, from the perspective of business history, from the perspective of social history, from the perspective of diplomatic history, or if aviation is history, air transport is used to understand how the movement, to understand the movement of capital in entrepreneur culture, and from basically from the perspective of business history. And raising such a question as this, which social groups were involved in owning and managing and running the aviation company, and which social group were usually using the aviation or air transport, who were the shareholders in the aviation company, and how airlines or air transport had changed people's lives from its inception, and in turn how it saved the development of commercial aviation. So since its inception, air transport has acted as a vehicle, a wheel for long distance travel. In fact, with the coming of the air transport, it revolutionized the concept of time, distance, space, and mobility. Air transport, aviation has remained a vehicle of historical dynamism through the expansion and intensification of the traffic of goods, people, and ideas, circulation of ideas across boundaries, across different regions. So aviation came to be intimately connected with flows of people, intensifying circulation, movement, of people, goods. It facilitated imperial interaction within and across the empires. Not only elite players, but ordinary flyers shaped the story of commercial aviation. And it soon came to be perceived as the lifeline for maintaining empires and their geopolitical interests, as it intensified the movement of elite with executive uh, and decision-making power, making it more faster, speedier that we see. As far as the existing literature is concerned, with regard to air transport, we see that most existing literature on aviation predominantly deals with technological aspect. However, in the recent times that we have seen that new studies had emerged looking at from the angle of from different perspective, contextualizing air transport technology within the framework of global geopolitics. For instance, Jennifer Van Vleck, who is a faculty in Smithsonian Institute in Washington, D.C., highlighted the role of Pan American Airways, which is most popularly known as Pan Am, the role of Pan Am or aviation in the rise of American global prominence. More studies recently had foregrounded the link between commercial aviation and imperialism. Cotton Pire looks at the aviation as a vital tool and agent of British Empire in South Africa. Chandra Deepimul, another study, looks at the ways in which aviation intersects with society, how it interacts with society, how it changes the lives of the erstwhile British colonies in the Caribbean island. And very recently, Sasang Sa, who is a faculty at Harvard University Business School, has studied aviation as part of business biography from the perspective of management studies. He looks at how aviation industry in India was nationalized and brought under state control in 1953. However, my study seeks to consider today looks at or consider how the British Empire, the Chinese nationalist government, and the Americans attempted to use this crucial transport system or attempt to utilize the potentiality of air transport technology during the war period. And in doing so, I'll try to explore in how this was in context in the coming of the air transport in the Northeast. As far as air transport or aviation history is concerned, with regard to South Asia, the history of aviation industry in India started under the British rule in the late 1920s. Imperial Airways, who later on began to be known as British Airways, connected Karachi as early as 1929. Then you have Royal Dutch Airlines, the KLM, which connected parts of Southeast Asia with its colonies and Europe. So we see how during the interwar period there is an expansion of air transport aviation since its inception. So during the interwar period, imperial governments and empire view air transport as a strategic asset and enterprising promoters saw an opportunity for profitable investment in aviation industry. And this historical development foments the growth of aviation in India or South Asia. And soon we see in 1932, G.R.D. Dadda ventured into this commercial aviation to promote Tata Airlines. It began as an airmail link and transformed into carrying passenger much later. In the next year, 1933, we see the commencement of another airlines, Indian National Airways, which was established by R.E. Grant Govan, a Delhi-based British industrialist. And for most part of the 1930s, and especially the early 40s, Tata Airlines and Indian National Airways operated in the domestic skies of India, South Asia. Tata Airlines, since its inception from 1932, dominated the line between Karachi to Bombay, later on extending to Ceylon, Colombo, then parts of these southern states. Then the Indian National Airways connected Kolkata, Dhaka, and Rangoon to this Myanmar. And the coming of the Second World War saw the active participation and also led to expansion of aviation sector, not only commercial but also wartime operation. We saw many aerodromes were built, and it is in this context that we see many aerodromes were built by RAF in Royal Air Force under British government in British Assam. So many aerodromes were built during the wartime, just before the Second World War, beginning of the Second World War. So, and then in the post-war period, we see that many year post-war period witness actually the growth in number of commercial aviation companies, new ventures in aviation by industrialists, princely states led to the rise of airlines such as Bharat Airways, which was started by G.D. Birla, and then we have Kalinga Airways and many others like the Himalayan Airways, and then Deccan Airways started by the Nizam of Hyderabad. And all of these airlines we see were finally nationalized in 1953 by the government of India. And since 1953, they were all subsumed into one corporation, which was came to be known as Indian Airlines, serving the domestic, dominating the domestic skies, and Air India, the Maharaja, which dominated the international skies, connected across different, connected India with different countries. So this was a very brief history on looking at on how aviation industry came about in India. And my research interest is particularly looking at this commercial aviation in contrast to military aviation. So I'll be particularly focusing on this, but today's talk will be forming a very small portion of my research where I look at the Northeast, and which was part of my PhD chapter that looks at the coming of these, the making of this transnational air connectivity during the war period, Second World War period in Assam and elsewhere in Northeast that we see. So what we see is this an attempt by the nationalist government, a Chinese nationalist government under Chiang Kai-shek, and with the expansion of Japanese control, Japanese expansion, what Chiang Kai-shek wanted was to connect aviation routes with India, and Assam was seen as the most shortest line. And since then, the Chinese government, nationalist government, sent proposal to the British government at New Delhi starting from 1939 for setting up an air link between Assam and China, particularly the center of the nationalist center of the nationalist government, Chinese national government, which was based in Chongqing. So Chongqing in the southern China, and before 1939, the Chinese nationalist government has already connected with Burma, and they wanted to extend this line to the northeast. And this was the context in which the coming of the air transport in northeast that began. So what I'm going to do is that we'll just give brief introduction and then brief history of this making of this air connectivity, air connection between China and India, and then we we can discuss it more in the question hour or a comment that will. So what we see is this. The Chinese nationalist government had by early as 1929, they had expanded, or in fact formed and aviation ministry already, and played, since they augmented that the aviation would play a very important part as part of their military power, and in defeating not only the communists but the warlords and the Chinese warlords, and then also the Japanese expansion, to check the Chinese communist expansion, and then the warlords and the Japanese on the other. So since the 1920s that we see the Chinese nationalist government or nationalist party set their sights on building of a modern air force right from 1929, and soon it was materialized by forming a national aviation administration. And in this, Americans played a very essential role in the development of the Chinese nationalist aviation, military aviation. This coming of this aviation administration under the Chiang Kai-shek government began to import not only American airplanes and aircraft, but also American technicians to train the Chinese military, or to train pilots. And since then, many of the Chinese were sent to America to learn the art of flying. In fact, the president of the Chinese aviation equipment company was an American businessman named by Floyd Newman Shoemaker. So it started as part of the military expansion in the to to expand its military power. And in fact, Americans played very important role in organizing the Chinese Nationalist Air Force from 1929. It was in this context that Chinese National Aviation Corporation, which was a commercial aviation and a joint commercial venture that we see this coming off the coming of CNAC. So I'll be most of my part of my lecture I'll be referring at as CNAC, Chinese National Aviation Corporation, and Chinese CNAC was an joint venture between the Chiang Kai-shek government and Pan Americans Airways, Pan Am, which was in fact established in 1927 till its decline in very recent in 1991. So the Chinese nationalist government had 55% share in this commercial aviation, and the Pan Am had 45% shares, holding pattern one divided into 55-45 ratio. And it was this joint venture that expanded slowly in the Chinese skies, not only the Chinese skies controlled by the Chinese nationalist government, but also they wanted slowly, with its initiation, since its establishment, they began to expand its air routes or air connectivity to Southwest China and Rangoon. And it managed to secure license for operating as far as Lasio, which is located in northern Burma, and Rangoon. And then they wanted to, the CNAC wanted to expand its connectivity, air connectivity. In contrast, the Indian National Airways, as I just pointed out, that it has connected Rangoon. And so, in fact, by 1939, when the proposal came, so we see as stiff competition was a stiff competition in this aviation business or aviation industry between these different rival groups. In fact, the Indian National Airways rallied around for looking at this. In fact, the proposal of CNAC, and the British government initially turned down this proposal that came first in 1939. They wanted to expand this line from connecting Chongqing, Kunming to Rangoon, and then they wanted to connect to northeast British Assam and Kolkata. So CNAC wanted to extend their air service from Rangoon to India. It was against this backdrop that CNAC in 1940 again presented another proposal to the British Indian government to further its air service in India. And they proposed the proposal for air service or connection between included between Chongqing and Sadia, which is in Hodia or Sadia in upper Assam. And the proposal was initially opposed by the government, British government in New Delhi. However, the company managed to secure commercial and freight air service through connecting between Rangoon and Kolkata by this alternate route. And in fact, the rapid expansion of Japanese power in Southeast Asia had been a worrying concern for the nationalist government under Chiang Kai-shek. And the various Chinese Airways company that has begun manufacturing with the help of the Americans. The many factories began to be set up in northern Burma and many places in southern China that aircraft factory began to produce. But the expansion of Japanese power in South China Sea and its expansion of control of various ports and the occupation of French Indochina by the Japanese forces and the bombardment or bombing of parts of southern China and northern Burma, in fact, threatened or compelled the CNEC to seek out for a less vulnerable air route between India and China, and they send a reproposal of the connection between Assam, between India and China for a possible air routes. So in late 1940, 36 Japanese planes had bombarded the Loing aircraft factory run by American, which was located just at the close of Chinese border in northern upper Burma. Much had been destroyed by the bombing by the Japanese air forces. The American entrepreneur, businessman William D. Pauli, who ran this Loing aircraft, and who was in fact a representative of Wright brothers, Curtis Wright, sales representative of China, were actually playing a major role for producing much of the aircraft for the Chinese nationalist government. This aircraft factory served as a service center for the CNEC, and most of the aircraft for Chinese nationalist government being manufactured here in Loing or assembled and repaired in this factory. However, with the bombing now, it was assured that it is not conducive to continue running the aircraft factory in northern Burma. And Pauli sent his representative to New Delhi, seeking the British intervention of the British authority, negotiating for transfer of most of the aircraft machine technology to India. And it was in this context, the successful of this diplomatic negotiation, that we see most of the Loing aircraft factories materials were sent to the newly established Hindustan Aircraft Company at Bangalore, which was established in late 1940, in December 1940, by an Indian business merchant called named by Walchand Hirachand. And later on, the rest is history of the coming of the Hindustan Aeronautic Limited, that aircraft factory. And this aircraft factory, out of this negotiation that we see, began to feed the Chinese Air Service or CNEC, and as well as for Royal Air Force in India. So under this backdrop, against this backdrop, what we see is this 1941, the CNEC renewed its application for air freight service from Assam and Chongqing that we see, and which was to serve as a very vital route if the Japanese forces occupy or expand to Burma. And the representative from both CNEC and Chinese nationalist government arrived in New Delhi to propose the launching of the air service between China and India. The negotiation was characterized with certain friction, diplomatic, frictions and tensions. And what we see is this: the British, in fact, authorities suspecting whether that this line would whether it is actually truly a commercial or freight service in nature. And in fact, the British government was in fact suspicion that the Japanese, it would take the attention of the Japanese in the much where British capitals are invested, and that Assam's tea garden and oil plants would be exposed to Japanese Air Force once it Japanese forces expand to Burma. So initially it was turned down, but with various players, and since Britain was under the Allied power, and in 1941 the first proposal began to be accepted, and in the meantime, the aerodrome in Dinjan was built by the RAF, Royal Air Force, with the help of deleverers that spread, just nearby the tea plantation in located just nearby the Brahmaputra River, which was a very conducive place for building an aerodrome, and that we see, since then, a large number of aerodromes began to be built during the Second World War, like Chabua and many others in many other places in Impal, Tulihal Airport, Silchar, Dimapur. All these aerodromes came up during the Second World War. So the CNEC argued that this line, the proposal of this line, was actually influenced by the shortness of the distance from Chinese territory or the Chinese center of the nationalist government. However, the government of India has this suspicious that CNEC's intention was something else. So all this kind of, I'll just cut short about this diplomatic friction that goes into the coming of this line, into the coming of the first air link between China and India and British Assam that we see. So given the changing geopolitics dynamics of Asia in the aftermath of the Japanese expansion in Singapore, and then finally the capture of the Burma Road, what we see is this, the British government has to accept this request of the CNEC or proposal coming from the Chinese nationalist government. And it was in this context that we see in 1941, November 1941, the first trial of this airline link between Chongqing, Kunming, and Sadia was made. On the Inspector General or the Superintendent of Lakhimpur District, Assam, on 23 November 1941 reported that a plane of CNEC, a plane aircraft Douglas TC-3 owned by CNEC company arrived on November 23 in Dinjan. It comprises of various important officials, and it included the Ministry of Communication under Chiang Kai-shek government, named by Nietzsche, a Chinese minister, Kiai Nietzsche, who was a minister for communication, and various others. He was accompanied by many others important office holders of the Chinese nationalist government. and including the crew, which consisted mostly of the Americans, which were in fact helping the nationalist government to expand its aviation industry since from 1929. So most of this pilot includes the Americans and technicians, aircraft technicians included American officials. And this aircraft has arrived from Chongqing via Lasio, northern Burma, and has arrived in November 23, 1941 in Dinjan, and it in fact this trial run which made it possible for establishing its airlink with Kunming, Chongqing to Dinjan in Assam. And after the bombing or capture of the Burma Road, in 1942 by the Japanese forces, now it was to be materialized. This line was to now materialize. So what we see is that initially the proposal of this air transport between Assam and China was a commercial freight that the CNEC or Chinese government argued for maintaining a supply route. But this wartime arrangement, what we see is that it began to serve this commercial venture began to play an active part in the wartime operation, especially after the Burma Road was being captured by the Japanese forces, and we know well about the history of INA, Indian National Army, under Subhash Chandra Bose, which with the aid of Japanese forces that reached the Imphal, Manipur. So this was the context where air transport graduated from civil operation towards military ones when CNEC now started to operate with United States Army Air Forces from its base in Dinjan in Chabua, and in fact Dinjan became the headquarters of the CNEC for the entire war period. So therefore, in the northeast India, what we see is this during the wartime period, it saw the frontic air transport and coming of the aviation, which was basically aiming at opening routes, new routes, supply routes for maintaining supply routes for assisting Chiang Kai-shek nationalist government in fight against the Japanese forces that we see. So in the post-war period, that in the beginning of my lecture that I had mentioned, that most of we see a very that business ventures led to the coming of many such commercial aviation in India, and in fact the Americans which left most of these aircraft by the end of when the Second World War ended, and it was now the business class in India, like G.D. Birla and industrialists, big industrialists, wanted to purchase and initiate this started this aviation company. And we see as a result of this 1946, we see as much as more than 7 aviation companies in India starting. being initiated in and dominating different routes. For example, G.D. Birla started Bharat Airways and started to dominate its line with Kolkata to Hong Kong and Burma, and then a phase came where we see the decline of aviation industry, commercial aviation industry in India, and all these aerodromes or airfields that came about. Many aerodromes that were built during the wartime were in fact many of them were being closed down in the Northeast, and many others the writings had pointed out about the oral memory of these experiences of the people of this coming of this air transport, aviation transport. Very fascinating account that we have today being written down in some scholars in Nagaland and Manipur that recount the how people experience and how it changed the worldview of the people that we see. So many of such aerodromes began to be listed as surplus in the post-war period. Surplus airfield began to be closed down. Dinjan, in fact, the main base of the CNAC, Chinese National Aviation Corporation headquarters is being now not being used anymore, and many other such aerodromes that was built, airfield that was built, began to be closed down in Assam, except for a few that was considered to be vital in the post-independence period to maintain states' control in Northeast. For example, the Tulihal in Imphal, in Manipur, and then Dimapur Airport and many others airport were still kept. Jabua, which played a very active aerodrome, which was very active during the wartime, still remains under the today very actively remains under the Indian Air Force. So this was the context in which I tried to, I wanted to share in this is the context of the coming of the air transport in Northeast and the connection, transnational connection between British Assam and Burma and China. So I'll like to end here. Thank you. Maybe we can discuss.
Thank you so much, Dr. For accepting our invitation and giving us a detailed and insightful session on the history of aviation in India and connecting India to different parts of the world and the special role of aviation evolving as a lifeline in the Northeast. Sir, we are now open to questions from the audience. I'll take up the first question that is mentioned on the chat box. How did the Second World War help in the building of transnational air transport in the region, and how did it affect the system of air transportation in the region?
In fact, the entire my paper. I mean, I was trying to talk about this on the very fact that I had not elaborated the transnational diplomacy or the kind of friction that certain tensions went on in building this transnational air transport, air connection. So this arrangement, what I'm trying to make a point here is this was characterized by a certain tensions between these different transnational players, and as a result of this, we see finally, because of the Japanese occupation of Singapore and its expansion and control of the Burma Road led to this immediate immediate cause led to the coming of this aviation. But we see that the post-independence period, in fact, I forgot to point out about the certain kind of tensions and frictions involved between the relationship between General Joseph Stilwell, who was the American, in charge of the American forces assisting the Chinese nationalist government, and Chiang Kai-shek. Between this, Stilwell and Chiang Kai-shek, and Chiang Kai-shek wanted these air routes to be, at the top priority, but Stilwell saw that if the Burma road is being captured by Japanese forces, then he wanted to, cut out a different land route, and he prioritized land route and built. And this was the context in which Ledo Road was built to supply to assist from the nearest ports of India. For Americans, land lease, under land lease, war materials assistance was being docked at Kolkata Port, and from Kolkata Port, the Assam Bengal Railway, it was taken from Assam Bengal Railway to to Upper Assam, and Ledo Road was being cut. And in fact, there's a very interesting study looking at by one of the Chinese scholar looking at the issue of American assistance to Chiang Kai-shek government during the war period. And in fact, it was so there are a whole lot of this kind of, because of time constraint, that I did not go into this discussion of between the relationship between Chiang Kai-shek and General Stilwell. Ledo Road began to be renamed as Stilwell Road, and today is I think it's not opened. It touches Upper Burma and then southern China. So we have this kind, but obviously the role of aviation was very crucial in the assisting Chinese nationalist government, in fact Japan, and so the crucial role of aviation and wartime air transport, it played a very important role in the Second World War.
Yeah, sir, there is one more question that I received. How and where can one look for the sources of air transportation used in the Second World War in the region?
Well, many of it are available. I mean, colonial archives and Assam archives also. I'd been looking at Assam archives, and an article by Imtigar Kamtekar also to some extent mentions in parts about in an article called Seaver of 1942, where he thus brings in the discussion of how in different parts of India this practice of air raids were being practiced, and how people feared that Japanese would soon Japanese airplanes would soon dominate the skies of their cities. So as far as northern India, Bombay, people were, so he accounts in this article, very interesting article, if one has to read on this kind of, how the role of rumors played out during the wartime. So he looks at the rumors during the wartime, how it brought fear psychosis among the city dwellers and people. In fact, National Archives has many such documents to if you wanted to look at. And I was basically, I'm more interested in looking at commercial airways, aviation industry, and there are two different things here. Military air transport is different, and commercial aviation is a different form of which is solely owned and managed by the industry or businessman. So I'm looking at this commercial angle, commercial aviation. So most of it are available, and I'm trying to explore. I'm trying to learn Chinese, so that I wanted to expand my work, and in fact, American Airways has a very a good archive. I was told by some of my friends who are in America, and a university. I'm forgetting the name of the university, has a huge collection of the archival materials of the Pan Americans. In fact, Pan Americans has expanded this service Pan Pacific. They wanted to expand their services to China, and Pan American soon establishing its and then also where I begin with this, that Jennifer Van Flank look at the role of Pan Americans, how it played an important American geopolitics, or Pan Americans actually played a very influential role during this wartime period. So you have a large number of accounts on this archival documents.
Thank you, sir, for answering those questions. I think these are the only questions that we have received from the audience. And thank you so much, sir, for more importantly, for sticking to the time limit of this webinar. For all those among the audience who have questions further, may feel free to write to us on our email ID. So thank you so much, Dr. Santosh, for this enlightening talk. Here, I, Architect Mildred Jose, your moderator. Yes, sir. Sorry.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It was very interesting to see. Thank you so much.
Yes, our pleasure. Here, I, Architect Mildred Jose, your moderator for today, conclude the first day of the webinar lecture series organized by the Center for Archaeology and History. Last but not the least, thank you so much to all the participants of the webinar and all our well-wishers for patiently listening through and making this day a success. A gentle reminder to all our participants to fill in the feedback form. The link for the same is provided in the chat box. Hoping to see all of you again for the next session on the next Sunday. Thank you all. Namaste.